Great. So some of you, many of you actually, I will have met before, but just to give you a bit of my background, it's been fairly long and varied, but pretty much all of my 20 plus years, I've been in and around HR and payroll technology, in various guises, everything from talent acquisition right through to payroll, and even paying pensioners, every aspect of that process. I suppose similar to actually Lara, I've not classically a finance background. I would have started out in science and engineering, quantum mechanics. I ended up at one point programming Formula One simulators, and that's where I moved into technology space. So everything I've done has been in and around data and information and the best use of that. And I suppose ultimately that's where my real interests lie. And I suppose that deviated fairly quickly into the payroll space, and payroll is just I find it such a fascinating field in that you can learn an awful lot about how a business operates, and really the mechanics of the success of a business can be very easily correlated back to the information that's hidden in the payroll in various guises. So I'm going to talk about different aspects of that today. I'm going to talk ultimately about how to bring all of that together, and how the best use and correct use of data can really add huge value to a business. And how the face of that is changing massively in the global payroll industry. So if I move through these things, what do we mean by true integration? Ultimately, it's the seamless flow of information. And as actually Laura touched on earlier on, there's a huge number of sources of information, particularly in payroll. And ultimately, payroll can quite often be the downstream relation of a lot of related processes throughout the HR lifecycle. So that seamless flow of information through an entire business process, and regardless of the source of truth, which in the case of payroll is many sources of truth to get to the correct answer. And what's really changing in the payroll space at this stage, particularly driven by technology, is presenting that end-to-end process in a unified user experience. So instead of going into one system, doing one aspect of something, going into another system, doing a different aspect of it, really being able to present all of that in an integrated flow of information and seamless user experience. Now, what does that really mean, and why should we care about that is probably the next thing to talk about. So it's really easier to compare with and without integration. And then after that, I'll touch on where integration is going and how it's changing. So the first thing really is going from those disparate sources of information and having almost a catalog of data sources to a single source of truth for global payroll. Now, that's a very challenging thing to do. As we all know, working global payroll, the sources and the destinations of the data are almost like a spider web when you look at the full global picture. So having a single technology solution to drive the unification of that is fundamental to being successful. There's huge, extensive administration effort in collating all of that information, whether it's sourcing information from new joiners, whether it's managing the changes in the day-to-day activities of the individual people of the business, whether it's taking feeds of data that are related to manufacturing, time management, all those different aspects, and feeding those cleanly and clearly into a process. And ultimately, payroll is as strong as the data that goes into it. What that's really doing is allowing people to move away from those laborious activities through integration into the more high value add, and having the data outputs for payroll as a byproduct of good business process. Moving away from manual data uploads is a really fundamental piece. So many of the sources of information for payroll classically have come from manual feeds, whether they're manual feeds from new joiners, whether they're manual feeds from other systems. And there's really no great need for that in the current operating environment with the technology that's now available in the payroll space. There's no need for that to still be the case. It's purely a case of moving forwards and using the best technology that's currently available to drive not doing those manual processes. What that ultimately leads to is what we call information blending. So instead of looking at disparate pieces of a record, you're taking the best aspects of every piece of the puzzle and you're putting them together in one clean, full picture. And that's what data blending is. It's bringing everything together from different sources into one unified source of truth. You're moving from issues with data consistency to the same data point sourced in two places. Which one's real? Which ones are the most up to date? To having clear and reliable, accurate information in a timely manner. And that's really one of the most fundamental enablers in payroll, which, as we all know, is critically time bound beyond most other business processes. The other piece that's really clear in integrating data is that you're moving away from the risk of non-compliance. You're always sourcing your information from the most reliable source in the most timely manner, and you're building the compliance aspect of what you're trying to achieve into the process. So effectively, you're achieving compliance by design. Now, I'm going to touch very briefly on some of the challenges in the global payroll space, and I suspect many of these will be common to everybody. Really, the most fundamental ones are error-prone processing. And as I said a minute ago, the key thing with payroll is it's a highly repeatable process. Payroll in any local jurisdiction or globally is generally a formulaic process. So what's the biggest variable? Well, it's the quality of the data that's going into that process. So a fundamental focus on sourcing clean, coherent data and integrating that in a touchless manner, i.e. not needing people to manually intervene with that, not needing manual processes to be fed into the overall picture. That's fundamental to removing those errors from the process. And the security of data is also a really fundamental aspect of integration. And the key thing to think about here is the more data is moving around and the more people that need to touch it or need to manage it, or the more systems and processes it passes through, the more potential attack points and breakpoints there are in that process end to end. So I'll touch in a few minutes on the meaning of true integration and concepts that are now available in global payroll that actually really start to radically reduce those data touch points and enhance the security aspects as well. And the whole aspect of global payroll consolidation is really key. So being able to coherently pull data sources from quite disparate systems that don't necessarily speak the same language, don't hold data in the same structures and formats, but being able to pull that into a single consolidated form and structure for processing, which means as a person operating in payroll, either directly connected to payroll or as a downstream consumer of payroll information that we're involved in producing, you get one coherent way of looking at the world. And it doesn't matter what the jurisdiction is, it doesn't matter what the source of the data was originally, it's that clean, clear view of everything as it should be, which ultimately helps you achieve standardization. It helps you apply one set of operating procedures to a global problem and actually come up with a clean solution. Why do we care about that? Well, it's really down to efficiency of process. Efficient, repeatable process in payroll means that the accuracy and compliance of the payroll is going to be enhanced throughout the entire process. I'm going to pause at that point and just ask any questions so far, and please do jump in at any stage with anything. All good? I'll push on. Okay, payroll is not a new thing, as you all know. This is actually one of the first payroll implementations going back to early Athens. It's about 9,000 years ago now. I expect the implementation time was quite low, but it was a calculator, and it really did show that payroll isn't a new industry. And in some very strange regards, nothing had really moved particularly until arguably the mid-80s in terms of the technology available to payroll. Now things are radically shifting on a daily basis. The technology that's now available is shifting, but classically the investment in that technology hasn't been there. Payroll has often been the, I suppose, the poor relation in terms of the full employee HR lifecycle, and yet for many organizations, it's one of the biggest cost aspects of the business, but also one of the biggest areas of the business that correctly managed can really enhance your employee experience. So how do we look at integration? How do we consider it? And how do we put ourselves on a spectrum effectively of where we want to be, where we are now? And again, something Lara touched on earlier, understanding and assessing the as is really fundamental, but also understanding the to be and where we'd like to get to is a big part of that. So from the early Athenians with no integration, really up until recently, there's been very little more than flat file exchange. And a lot of global payroll operations still operate on flat file exchange in less technically capable organizations and providers. But ultimately, where we should be looking to shift is to the far right-hand side, where we're dealing with structured data, sourced and validated before it's fed into the process, managed and automated throughout that process, and ultimately delivered wherever physically possible through web services, which effectively means touchless process. It means real-time retrieval. It means instantaneous handshakes between systems, and it means that data really only resides where it needs to, which is a fundamental point from a security aspect. is minimization of the data you need. So systems and platforms that are purpose-built and delivering exactly what they're there for, in our situation, global payroll. Now, this isn't the end of the journey. This is really, some organizations are really starting to be able to drive into the 4s and 5s. And that takes effort, it takes preparation, and it takes clear leadership and thought as to how the global payroll operation should be. But the next stage of evolution of this is really moving into the 6, which we refer to as transient user interfaces. Now, it sounds like a complex term, but what does it really mean? It means rather than thinking about taking data from one system and shipping it into another, it means effectively entangling the systems so that the rule base from one source of truth, in this case global payroll, is actually utilized in another system at the source of entry. So for a new joiner into an organization, ultimately that would generally flow through the HR, HCM platform, actually having the capability within the HCM platform to consume the global payroll data rule base and actually validate the data being input into the HR onboarding process at that point in time, rather than capture from a repeated rule base, extracting that information and passing it to another system, which there are multiple failure points in, even with the strongest of integration solutions. What does that really mean? It means a truly global rule base that's provisioned at a local level and has absolute fundamental meaning to the country in which it relates to, but it's centrally controlled and governed in that everything is consistently managed. You know that the rule base is accurate, and then it's consumed and enforced at the point of entry. So effectively what you're doing is you're protecting the boundary and the integrity of your whole payroll process, because every door into the payroll process, even from other systems, is coherent and is properly managed. Why is this so important? Well, data sovereignty is one of the biggest topics right now in data generally, especially when in relation to PPI and HR related data. Individuals having control and understanding of where their data is, who's processing it, what exactly is held and for what period of time. So that concept of data sovereignty is fundamentally enhanced by applying the transient UI concept that payroll data is only in payroll platforms. How do you actually achieve this? Well, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, but from an overall perspective, it ultimately means you're using the most appropriate aspects of your technical estate as an employer for the things they were originally designed to do. So you're not necessarily having to implement a global HCM solution that has every rule for every country built into it to validate data. You're simply enforcing a globalized standard for HR practice, and then you're consuming that local information through the transient UI from a global payroll solution. And what that allows you to do is run clean, clear, consistent HR practice at a global scale, but ensure that as a byproduct of doing that, all the aspects you need for the global payroll operation are captured at the point in time, rather than retrospectively having to resolve that later on. It also means that from a global payroll operation point of view, you're treating everything in the same way. You've got one consistent view of the world, you're seeing one consistent user interface, you're dealing with your data in one specific way, and all of your result sets, validations, and ultimately your end employee experience is completely unified. It also means, as a fundamental byproduct to that, things that typically are quite challenging in the payroll space, like coherent financial systems reporting, general ledgers, all those fun things that anyone who's worked in payroll long enough will at some point have touched on, they effectively become very clean byproducts of running the payroll process rather than an afterthought that somebody is trying to engineer after the effect. How do you achieve that? Well, it's very simply by letting the data that's relevant flow in the right way and having it sourced at the right source of truth. So if you're looking to labor cost distribute your employees across different cost centers, locations, projects, op codes, all those different aspects, let the HR platform manage that, because that's fundamentally the most likely source of truth for it. Let that flow through the payroll process and let all these things come together in a single unified way to give the finance results in the way they should be. In terms of integration and automation, so what's the impact? I'm just going to check that, maybe a question. Oh, somebody's left. It's that good. So typically on the payroll cycle, you're looking at standard input collation for an extended period. You're looking for the processing time, the review and approval time, the funding, and the payment cycle. Well, what does integration and automation do to this? Really what you're doing effectively is, and I always think of payroll slightly as having to predict the future. Any payroll cutoff that is before the end of the payroll month means that you're really trying to best estimate what will happen between now and the end. Whereas with automation in place and with true integration in place, you're radically reducing that future looking predictive part. Everything is moving towards being fact rather than plan. And that's allowing you to have more time for the input collation. It means that more of the month has passed, more of the cycle has passed, even if it's not monthly. Your payroll processing time is radically reduced because the information is sourced and correct before it comes in, and it becomes that repeatable payroll byproduct. Your review time is enhanced, time to actually look at value add review of the payroll rather than purely at the error exception handling. And then ultimately you're moving the cutoff much closer to the payroll pay date. And that's really the most fundamentally important part of true integration, is it has quite a profound impact on the ability to deliver payroll in a much more time concise fashion. So it means how do you achieve it? Well, your automation of input retrieval is really quite key. How has that changed? Well, it's moved from feeding manual uploads into a payroll cycle to real-time web service retrieval, which a lot of tier 1 and tier 2 HCM platforms now have available. So be looking for a vendor that is capable of consuming that. Look for the ability to actually on demand pull the very latest to the second results in from the HR platform for processing. Have them validated absolutely instantaneously, and manage that exception process for any incomplete inputs, people whose records aren't complete, missing data points that are specific to a given country that may not form part of the master record approach. By implementing true integration, that's actually moved completely out of the cycle, because you can't finish the onboarding of an employee without the correct data to process the payroll. It really enhances that whole onboarding process. The integration of the in-country engines, again, through real-time processing, means that there's more time to review the payroll. The processing time is radically reduced, moving much more to real-time calculation. And the ability to then review those results in a coherent form and fashion means that as a payroll team, you're dealing with one way of operating. You're not dealing with a different method of operating depending on the jurisdiction. And that's probably one of the biggest factors on the effectiveness of a payroll team, is to be able to apply a single set of standards across the board to everything they're doing, and not being jurisdiction dependent. And then the last piece is around the integration to modern payment rails and shortening the execution time for delivering funds into bank accounts. Now, in the European region, that's not such a challenge because we're moderated by SEPA and the need for faster pay in the UK. Whereas in other jurisdictions, that is more challenging. But there are a lot of challenges a lot of challengers in the payment space in terms of the ability to deliver faster payment rails and better access to funds in developing countries. So ultimately, where do I see this going? Vision for the future in payroll is really very much targeted around that transient user interface experience. So having the correct rule bases built into the right source of information and applying those at the point of entry of data. So you're never letting bad things into the process effectively. That's the short version. You're protecting the integrity of the payroll process by enhancing the upstream processes, whether that's HR onboarding, time management, or any other. But it's really about externalizing what historically has been the internal mechanics of payroll, letting the systems that need to know the rule base know them in a way that they can manage them. Effectively allowing customers as well to much more self-manage and drive the configuration and management of the global payroll environment, being able to execute much closer to real time, being able to retrieve their own data from their own HR platforms and other related benefits or time management solutions as and when they want to for execution, rather than the classic integration feed of moving files around. And then ultimately that aspect of data sovereignty and the need for the employee to understand and self-manage. A key component of the transient user interface and the true integration concept is that always go to the source of truth, the best source of truth for whatever it is you're trying to get. And in this situation, ultimately, it's going to be the employee. The employee knows their own details more coherently. They have the information about their previous employment, they know their own personal circumstance, and by exposing these through mobile first technology, it makes it much easier for the data to be sourced correctly into the payroll platform. I'm going to move on, if there's time, I'm going to move on to a demo, but I'm going to check if we have questions first.
Hi, Richard. Yeah, I was just literally typing that in the chat that you're going to run a demo if people want to stay on. So, which I hope everyone will do. So yeah, if you've got time, that'd be fabulous. And some people have asked about the slides. We will send out the slides as well once today's finished. So yeah, sorry, Richard, I will shut up and let you carry on.
No problem. So I'll run into a brief demo. Bear with me as I get that open. So as I log into the Immedis platform, this is just to give you a sense of where true integration is really quite important. It's having that coherent source of truth for global payroll. So how do we manifest that? Well, we give the user a single view of the entire payroll operation. And there's a couple of key aspects to that I'm going to touch on. First of all, very quickly, I'm going to touch on the consolidated data viewpoint and ultimately the end results of why we're trying to get to achieving this. It's that single view of the world and single view of everything relevant to payroll. So having that unified experience, having all the data fed back in, regardless of how the actual jurisdictional calculation operates, having a single way of analyzing the payroll and not needing to understand the complexities of that payroll. Whilst you can learn them and you absolutely can drill into them, the ability really is there at the very top to understand and manage at a global scale. So that's made very simple by unified framework for pulling all the data together. And this is effectively what we refer to as the harmonized gross to net, which means it doesn't matter. You don't have to have local knowledge of a payroll to be able to understand this. And yet, if you do want to drill into specific detail and you want to see the unification of payroll gross to net versus general ledger accounting versus in-country specific elements, that's all completely achievable without really having to deeply understand the forensic nature of each of the payrolls. Now, if you do, great. And if you want to drill into that level of detail, you absolutely can do that. But it means as a global payroll team, what you really need to look more towards is people who are data capable and have the ability to understand and manage data. And you'll end up with a much more robust, strong payroll process. Other aspects of that as well, then, in terms of the transient user interface components, to just look at a distribution of a global payroll, European operating center, and then specifically into an individual record within that. The ability to actually self-administer and source that information where the core record has come from a HCM web service pull instigated by the payroll team of this customer. But effectively, there are also other fundamental components that are relevant only to certain countries, and having the UI to be able to actually input those as and when they're sourced, either from the employee, from previous employment, from various other sources, and be able to basically blend the data from all those different sources into a single unified version of the truth, and have that sense of completeness when that's done. And obviously, these rules differ completely by country. And they're completely self-managed within the Immedis platform, so we know the rule base on which we operate each of the jurisdictions. It also then means, from a user experience point of view, you've got a single way of looking at payslips and single source of managing that. And I don't have a password for that payslip, which would make sense. And then lastly, to run into the single mode of operating all of the currently open payrolls. And again, regardless of how the calculation actually occurs in country, having a unified approach to drawing all of that together, single view of the truth, so that all you see is what you're currently dealing with, and everything else is moved aside. And same story with historic details and documents, retrieval and access to all of those in one unified place. So it really doesn't matter the detail underneath, you're managing in one way of management.